Tonight's mystery unfolds with shadows, secrets, and a truth waiting to strike when least expected. Settle in, and tell me where in the world are you listening from tonight, and subscribe so you never miss upcoming mysteries. Nero Wolfe and the Poison, meant for Fritz. The night had settled over the brownstone like a thick wool blanket, the kind Wolfe would complain was too draft-prone, when the house phone, not the office line, began ringing as if it had decided I was overdue for indictment. The jangle tore through the quiet halls with the kind of insistence that makes a man check whether he left a body on the sidewalk by accident. I hadn't, but at midnight, a ringing house phone is Manhattan's way of saying, "Brace yourself." I was halfway down the second-floor landing when I grabbed the receiver. "Nero Wolfe's residence," I said, giving it the usual polish. A man's voice shot into my ear, sharp, strained, and cracking at the edges. "Mr. Wolfe, God, please, your chef, tell him not to drink anything. Don't let him—" "What? Who is this?" I demanded, gripping the phone hard enough to make the cord whine. "Slow down. What's wrong with my chef?" A clatter, a thump, and what might have been a stifled cry sliced through the connection. Then came a scraping sound like the receiver was dragged across a floor, and the line went dead with the kind of finality you only hear in cheap movies or bad nights. I stared at the receiver a beat too long before hanging up. Midnight is the hour when nothing decent calls a household, and certainly no one calls to warn you your chef might be in line for poison. Footsteps padded rapidly across the marble downstairs. Fritz appeared at the bottom of the stairs, wearing a thick grey robe tied in a knot that looked strangled. His usually serene face was stretched tight, wide eyes glimmering behind spectacles that had slipped halfway down his nose. "Archie? The phone?" His accent thickened when he was worried, which meant this was thicker than molasses in January. I nodded. "Someone thinks you're on a hit list, Fritz. Come on, let's get Wolfe." Fritz gasped, hand fluttering to his chest. "Me? But why? Who?" "Let's ask the big man." I crossed the hall with Fritz trailing close enough to read over my shoulder if I'd been carrying a book. I hit the elevator switch. The cab hummed as it descended, slow as a sermon. At times like this, I always wished Wolfe invested in something with pep, but no. Inertia is part of the decor. The elevator doors slid open to reveal Wolfe himself, looking as rumpled as a mountain. His mustard-coloured robe wasn't tied all the way, and his hair was mussed, a sight rarer than a cooperative witness. He squinted at me, then at Fritz. "This had better be indispensable," Wolfe growled, stepping out. "It is intolerably late." "It's indispensable," I said, "unless you want Fritz to kick the bucket before breakfast." Wolfe's brows came together so sharply they might have fused. "Explain," briefly. We moved to the office, dimly lit by a single banker's lamp. The place smelled faintly of the vanilla Fritz used earlier in the kitchen. The scent didn't belong in a midnight crisis, but there it was, dancing around the tension like an uninvited guest. I gave them the details, the frantic voice, the warning about Fritz, the sudden cut-off. Wolfe listened, chin tucked, fingers steepled. He made a sound that wasn't quite a grunt, more like a philosopher choking on a philosophical dilemma. "You permitted the call to end prematurely," he said. "Sure," I answered lightly. "Next time someone's getting tackled on the other end, I'll ask them to take turns," he snorted. "Your impetuous idiocies are inconvenient, yet not without worth." I considered that his version of a bouquet of roses. Fritz wrung his hands. "But who would wish to harm me? I offend no one. I cook." "A volatile profession," I said. "People have been stabbed over vegetables." Wolfe glared, but only mildly. He turned his focus on Fritz. "You have received nothing unusual in recent days?" Fritz hesitated. That alone put the temperature in the room up a few degrees. Fritz hesitating is like hearing a sermon interrupted by a cough. You know, trouble is brewing. "Well," Fritz said finally, "there was the basket." Wolfe straightened. "What basket?" I asked. "A gift," Fritz murmured. "Delivered this afternoon, a selection of rare spices from a gourmet society, one I have never heard of. The note said they admired my artistry." His voice cracked around the word. "I meant to investigate it tomorrow." I whistled softly. "That's one way to show admiration. Send a man some deadly herbs." Wolfe turned his head toward me slowly, the way a man turns toward a buzzing mosquito deciding between slap or mercy. "Archie?" "Just saying." "Fetch it," Wolfe ordered. Fritz looked stricken. "It is in the kitchen, on the table. But, Mr. Wolfe, should we touch it?" Wolfe nodded once, heavy as the stone falling. "Archie will," then softer, "but carefully." I didn't relish the idea of handling anything addressed to Fritz with a possible skull and crossbones attached, but I headed to the kitchen. The basket sat on the long table like a model posing for a catalogue. Wicker, ribboned, stuffed with glass jars and sachets. My eyes caught the label immediately. Thick ivory cardstock embossed with a curling insignia. The Gastronomic Chronicle of Manhattan. If there was a top-shelf culinary newsletter, this was it. I didn't touch the jars. I carried the basket by its outer frame, arms extended like it was a radioactive baby, back to the office. Wolfe was waiting with a glare. "Put it on my desk, but do not open anything." I set it down. Fritz made a soft, frightened sound that put knots in my spine. Wolfe examined the label without touching the contents. "This printing," he said quietly, "is not inexpensive. Whoever sent this has resources." "And bad intentions," I said. "You don't warn a man at midnight about chamomile tea." Fritz clutched the robe at his throat. "I do not understand. I'm no enemy to anyone in New York." "Not willingly," I said. "But who knows? Maybe you slighted a gourmet at the market. Maybe you used too much garlic once." Fritz looked horrified. "I would never." Wolfe pinched his eyes shut. "Archie, restrain your levity." "Sure," I said, "but only as a limited-time special." Wolfe opened his eyes again. "The man on the telephone. You could recognize nothing? No accent? No tone you have heard previously?" "He sounded like a guy who'd just noticed death leaning over his shoulder," I said. "He didn't sound familiar, but he knew about Fritz." Wolfe's jaw tightened. "This is insupportable." He turned to Fritz. "You will not step into the kitchen unsupervised until I say so. If you must boil water, Archie will observe." I blinked. "Me? Kitchen guard duty?" "You are mobile," Wolfe replied, "and disposable." Fritz gasped. I laughed. Wolfe allowed the corner of his mouth to twitch by a millimetre. "There's affection in that somewhere." He flicked his hand at me. "Lock the basket in the safe." "Right," I said, "before it sprouts fangs." I picked it up again. Wolfe rang for the elevator to ascend to his room. His orchids awaited him in the morning, and he needed his sleep. Fritz followed me to the safe, watching the basket as if it might leap. "Mr. Goodwin," he whispered, "do you think someone truly wishes me dead?" I slid the safe door shut, spun the combination, and met his eyes. "Fritz, I don't know yet, but someone definitely wishes you upset. And they've succeeded. Which means Wolfe is going to tear through Manhattan until he knows why." Fritz exhaled, shoulders loosening just a fraction. "Mr. Wolfe will know." "Yeah," I said. "And until he does, nobody drinks anything in this house without me sniffing it first." Fritz managed a trembling smile. We heard the elevator doors close upstairs. The brownstone settled again, but not peacefully. The air felt stretched, thin, waiting. Someone had tried to send poison to Fritz Brenner, and whoever they were, they'd just rung the wrong house at midnight. When I stepped out of the cab the next morning with a paper cup of coffee and a temperament fit for mild assault, the first thing I noticed was the woman standing on our stoop like she'd been carved out of expensive worry. She had the kind of frame photographers call delicate and cab drivers call trouble. Her gloves were pale cream, matching her hat, and she kept touching the tips together as if counting invisible beads. The sun wasn't high yet, just slicing between buildings enough to glint off her hairpin. At that hour, no woman dressed like a luncheon invitation belonged on our steps unless Wolfe had committed a sin I didn't know about. She turned when I approached. Her eyes did a sweep of me. Hat, coat, patience level, and landed somewhere between relief and fright. "Mr. Goodwin?" "That depends," I said. "If you're here to advertise new encyclopedias, I'm the janitor. If it's trouble, I'm Archie." Her lips twitched like the idea of smiling was against her religion. "Trouble," she whispered. "My name is Claudia Venn. I must speak to Mr. Wolfe at once. It's urgent." "Everything at this house is," I said. "Come in before the neighbours think I'm running a finishing school." She stepped inside with an air of gratitude that was either genuine or professionally rehearsed. The foyer swallowed her perfume, something floral and shy, and while I hung my coat, she glanced around as though expecting a firing squad behind the umbrella stand. "Just so you know," I said, leading her to the office, "he's with his orchids until 11. Approaching during orchid hours is like approaching a volcano that reads Latin. You can leave a message, but not your body." "I'll wait," she said quickly, clasping her gloves again. They gave off a faint, odd scent as she passed. Saffron, of all things. That detail shot a spark through my brain, but I filed it under Ask Later. The office was swimming in soft morning light that made the dust motes look like lazy ballerinas. Fritz was hovering near Wolfe's desk as if it were a hospital bed, smoothing invisible creases in the blotter. He jumped slightly when he saw me enter with company. "Ah, Miss—" "Venn," she supplied. "Claudia Venn." Fritz bowed so gently he might have been greeting royalty, but the tremor in his hands gave him away. "Mr. Wolfe will be down shortly. Please, make yourself comfortable." Comfortable wasn't on her menu. She perched on the edge of the red chair like a sparrow keeping watch for hawks. Fritz moved toward the door, but paused to glance at her again, eyes narrowing faintly, before disappearing toward the dining room. At 11:02, the elevator groaned its way down. By 11:03, Wolfe lumbered in, fresh from the plant rooms, smelling faintly of orchid pollen and disapproval. He arrested his movement when he spotted Claudia. "Good morning, madam," he intoned. You are not expected." "No one expects trouble," she murmured. He grunted and made for his chair, settling into it like a monarch receiving unwelcome tribute. "Very well. Archie, elucidate." I gave him the quick run, the midnight call, the warning for Fritz, the basket in the safe. Wolfe's expression didn't change, but something tightened beneath his eyelids. Claudia rose an inch. "Mr. Wolfe, I'm here because I believe the spice basket came from my organization, but not from me, and not as a threat." Wolfe interlaced his fingers. "Who are you?" "Claudia Venn, secretary of the Culinary Circle of Manhattan." "Oh, splendid," I said. "A club of amateur stomachs." She shook her head. "Hardly. We are discerning." Wolfe let out a soft, contemptuous breath. "Archie." "I'll behave, I promise, though I didn't mean it." Claudia swallowed. "Mr. Wolfe, the Circle sends occasional gift baskets to renowned chefs, a gesture of respect. I believe Mr. Brenner received one as part of this program." Wolfe's brows climbed half an inch. "Respect in the form of unpredictable substances." She flinched. "I assure you they are vetted carefully." "Who vets them?" I asked. "Our treasurer, Philip Darnell." Her voice cracked on the name. "And where is he now?" Wolfe inquired. "We don't know." She finally spilled it in halting, breathy fragments. Darnell had been missing for 2 days. He'd last been seen working on the Circle's rare ingredient registry, a catalogue of exotic spices, herbs, additives, some historically used in royal kitchens, others in royal assassinations. The kind of book that would interest both gourmands and people who preferred their enemies silent. "Darnell kept meticulous notes," she said. "Every batch, every cellar, every sample. His ledger is missing." Wolfe's eyes flicked to me, a signal to start asking the questions he didn't want to lower himself to. "Miss Venn," I said, scooting forward, "when you say exotic spices, you mean fancy cinnamon, or stuff that makes a man chew the rug before keeling over?" She flinched again. "Some ingredients are potent but controlled." "Any monk's pepper on the list?" I asked casually. She blinked. "Yes, its extracts have historical applications in, well, poison," I finished. "Cute." Wolfe sighed at the ceiling like a saint enduring pagans. "Archie, restrain your prattle." "Restrained," I said. "Barely." Claudia herself looked ready to faint. "Mr. Wolfe, if something happened to Philip, if someone used our registry for malicious—" Wolfe raised a finger, and she snapped into silence like he'd pressed a mute button. "The saffron scent," I said, before she could continue. "Your gloves, that standard for you?" Her eyes widened. I was handling samples yesterday, for the tasting committee. It must have lingered." I nodded as if I believed her entirely, though the needle on my internal meter twitched toward convenient. Fritz appeared at the doorway then, hovering like an anxious steward. "Mr. Wolfe, shall I bring coffee?" "No." Wolfe didn't look at him. "Remain available." Claudia darted a glance at Fritz. Too quick, too nervous. She folded her gloves in her lap with surgical precision. The phone rang at 11:27. I crossed to answer it, expecting Lon Cohen hunting for gossip or someone offering Wolfe a job he'd refuse. Instead, Goodwin. "This is Kramer." His voice carried fatigue baked with gravel. He wasn't barking. That alone was a warning. "What's on your stove, Inspector?" I asked. "A body," he said bluntly. "Penthouse on East 61st. Neighbours found it this morning. Name matches, Philip Darnell." Behind me, Wolfe's head turned slightly, interest sharpening like a carving knife. Kramer continued, "I'm telling Wolfe to stay clear, and I mean clear, Goodwin. We'll handle it." "I'll pass it on," I said. "And Goodwin," the pause was tight, Tell him we'll update him, for once." Kramer hung up without ornamental cursing, which meant either he respected Wolfe today or he was too tired to bother. Both were rarities. I relayed the news. Claudia's face went white enough to pass for a powdered donut. She pressed a hand to her mouth. "Philip, dead." "So it seems," I said softly. She sagged into the chair, trembling. Fritz stepped forward impulsively, then checked himself and retreated a half-inch. Wolfe drew in a breath through his nose, long and loud. "You came here today," he said to Claudia, "to avoid involvement." "No, to seek protection," she whispered. "If Philip was harmed because of the registry, Mr. Wolfe, please, you must find who did this." Wolfe closed his eyes for a long moment, fingers tenting under his chin. I knew that pose. He was considering the shape of the job, the scale of annoyance and the potential for adequate compensation. Finally he said, "Madam, I will not be importuned. If you desire my services, you may engage them in the customary manner. If not, leave us." Tears shimmered in her lashes. I don't have a retainer with me." "Then acquire one," Wolfe said. "Good day." She rose shakily. I escorted her to the door. At the threshold she whispered, "Mr. Goodwin, tell him Fritz should be careful. Very careful." I resisted the urge to grab her sleeve. "Meaning what exactly?" Her lip trembled. "Just tell him." She hurried down the steps like she expected to be shot at. I closed the door and turned back toward the office. Wolfe was already reaching for the bell cord. "Fritz," he called, "my lunch at 1, and no experiments." Fritz nodded fervently and disappeared. I dropped into my chair. "Well, that was friendly." Wolfe stared at the desk as if trying to intimidate the wood grain. "Archie," he said quietly, "fetch the ledger, if we can locate it." "You planning to take the case?" He grunted. "When the woman returns with money." I stretched my legs. "Until then." He levelled a look that could have flattened a politician. "Until then, Archie, we prepare." And with that, he closed his eyes, dismissing me, sinking deeper into thought while the sunlight crept slowly across the rug. A picture of a man who would not lift a finger until paid, but who already knew he'd have to. I've seen my fair share of kitchens in New York, most of them the kind where a man might accidentally step on a cockroach the size of a philosophy major, but Philip Darnell's penthouse setup wasn't that kind of joint. It hit me the moment Pearlie Stebbins and I stepped inside, a wall of scents, ingredients, and pretension thick enough to slice. The place looked less like a kitchen and more like a shrine for worshippers of the almighty sauté pan. Shelves sagged under glass jars of salts with names longer than my patience, and the counters were a cluttered battlefield of preserved roots, powders, oils, and handwritten cards Darnell must have slaved over. Pearlie grunted behind me, a low bulldog sound. "You sightseeing or moving?" "Sightseeing," I said. "If I touch anything, the DA might start charging admission." Pearlie huffed again, which was his way of acknowledging the joke without admitting he'd heard it. Kramer had made it clear on the phone. I was here strictly as a civilian witness, which meant that the moment I sneezed in the direction of evidence, Pearlie would tackle me like a linebacker defending his last donut. Still, the lieutenant had no objection to me looking around, which was good, because the room was sending up more flares than an SOS signal. Darnell lay in the next room, but I avoided looking there for now. If you've seen one poisoned corpse, you've seen enough for a decade. I wanted to take the kitchen first. It always tells on its owner. There was a scorch mark on the stove the size of a man's ego. Fresh? Maybe. But I caught Pearlie eyeing it, and his lips compressed. "That's from last week," he grunted. "Neighbour says he set a towel on fire trying some fancy French number. Nothing to do with today." And here I was ready to blame a homicidal flambé. I shook my head. One of these days a red herring is going to wear a name tag just to make my life easier. Pearlie muttered something impolite. I moved deeper into the clutter. The jars lining the back counter seemed organized by theme. Salts, roots, peppers, and spices I couldn't pronounce without spraining a lip. I spotted a jar of monk's pepper, half full and labelled in neat block letters, the same herb that had made its way into Fritz's little gift basket. Its presence here wasn't proof of anything. Darnell was compiling a registry of rare ingredients, but seeing the same poison ordered twice by fate felt like a stage cue. I bent closer. The jar was smudged, the lid half-turned. Someone besides Darnell might have used it last. "Watch yourself," Pearlie barked. "Crime lab's not done." I'm looking with my eyes. "Not my paws," I said. He grunted. That was Pearlie's entire emotional vocabulary. Grunt for approval, grunt for disapproval, grunt for indigestion. I checked the adjacent counter and found an open book, Darnell's own notes judging by the handwriting, with a page on historical banquets and lethal condiments. Tasty reading. One margin note caught my eye. Extract tested, too potent, should dilute. That didn't suggest suicidal tendencies. It suggested a man who knew what he was handling. Pearlie cleared his throat. "You done here?" "Almost." I leaned back, surveying the room. "You ever notice, Pearlie, that people with strong feelings about truffle provenance always end up killing each other? It's the passion. Foodies are dangerous." Pearlie rolled his eyes. "You talk too much." "And yet, you continue to listen. That's the mystery of the human condition." I finally stepped into the parlour where Darnell lay. The corpse was slumped against the side of a leather armchair, head tilted as though he'd been pondering the ceiling's moulding before the poison clipped him. His skin had the faint grey tint of someone who'd crossed the finish line early, and there was a slight foam at the corner of his mouth. Monk's pepper, a killer with culinary ambitions. Footsteps approached. Kramer entered with the disgruntled dignity of a man who'd had too little sleep and too many corpses. His cigar was clenched between his teeth unlit. The building had strict rules, and he looked at Darnell, then at me. "You're here," he said. "I am, with Pearlie's gracious escort." Pearlie snorted. Kramer eyed me. "Don't touch anything." I haven't touched anything except the air, and even that felt risky. He grunted approval, surprising me. "Good." Kramer leaned over the corpse, his brow furrowing at the residue at the lips. "Lab says toxin, something exotic. Monk's pepper extract, stuff you need a specialist to prepare." "Like Darnell?" I suggested. Kramer didn't bite. "Or someone with access to his registry." He glanced at the counter in the kitchen and nodded at Pearlie. "Get a man on that registry note, copy it, check backgrounds of anyone he listed as handling test batches." Pearlie moved out. Kramer turned toward me. "This makes trouble for your chef." "Fritz," I corrected, "and he didn't do this." I didn't say he did, but Monk's pepper in that basket could be coincidence. I don't like coincidences. He scratched his jaw. "Tell Wolfe to keep him close, and tell him to stay out of trouble for once." "That's like asking the Statue of Liberty to sit down," I pointed out. Kramer sighed. "Just tell him." He started toward the hallway, then paused. His tone softened by a millimeter. "Goodwin. He's innocent until proven otherwise. I know that, but keep him close." That was as gentle as Kramer got. He left without barking further orders. I gave the room one last look, collecting impressions like fingerprints, the loosened jar lid, the missing ledger, the scorch mark that lied for sport, and Darnell's final posture. Nothing solved, everything humming. Time to bring it home to Wolfe. I headed back to the brownstone a little after noon, arriving just as Fritz placed the last fork for lunch. He looked up at me with the kind of worry that would make a stone feel sympathetic. I wasn't about to tell him what Kramer said until Wolfe heard it first. Delivering bad news prematurely to Fritz is like handing a candle to a man in a fireworks warehouse. Wolfe was already at his desk when I entered the office. It was 12:47, 13 minutes before lunch, which meant I had precisely 13 minutes before he'd barricade his attention behind a plate of something Fritz had spent all morning coaxing into glory. He didn't look up right away. When he finally did, it wasn't impatience in his gaze. It was something tighter, sharper. "What did you discover?" he asked. I gave him the report point by point, the way he likes it when he's pretending not to care. Darnell's kitchen laboratory, the rows of salts, the Monk's pepper jar with the loose lid, the scorch mark that lied, the open research notes, and finally the corpse himself. Wolfe listened with an expression carved from basalt. "And," I added, "Kramer says Monk's pepper extract killed him. Same type that showed up in Fritz's basket." Wolfe's fingers tightened on the chair's arms. Not noticeably to most people, but I've watched the man argue with fate enough times to know tension when it walks through the room. Nonsense, he snapped. Sure, I said lightly, complete nonsense. Except that the basket in our safe contains the same rare poison. Darnell handled it before dying. Someone warned us at midnight to keep Fritz away from drinks, and now the treasurer of the culinary circle is cooling on a penthouse floor with foam on his lips. Absolutely no connection whatsoever. Archie, his voice cut the air like a blade. Not now. And which is Wolfe's version of saying he's worried, and therefore can't afford to perform worry. I softened. Inspector Kramer told me to tell you, keep Fritz close. Wolfe inhaled sharply, the sound deep and grudging, as if admitting Kramer had used his brain cost him physical pain. Fritz, he muttered, is under this roof. If he remains here, he is safe. Unless the killer thinks sending gift baskets is only phase 1, I said. Wolfe shot me a glare that could peel paint, but he didn't disagree. At 1 o'clock on the dot, the bell cord trembled from Wolfe's tug, and Fritz appeared in the doorway with lunch. Something rich and aromatic, braised lamb, potatoes, and a sauce I couldn't identify, but would have gladly written poetry about. It was also the perfect excuse for Wolfe to refuse further conversation for exactly 1 hour. But today, he lingered. Archie, he said, remain. Fritz blinked, surprised but obedient, and began serving. Wolfe waited until he was gone before speaking again. You are certain the scorch mark is irrelevant? Pearlie's grunt was definitive, I said, and he's the kind of guy whose grunts should be cited in legal documents. Wolfe buttered a roll with slow, weighted strokes, the way a general sharpens a sword before battle. Describe again the note in Darnell's book. I did. The line about dilution, the margin scrawl. Wolfe closed his eyes, thinking. I could almost hear the gears turning, heavy, expensive gears that only turn when the case is worth the calories. This registry, he said finally. It is missing? Vanished, according to Claudia. Claudia Venn, Wolfe corrected, with the slightest emphasis that meant, names matter, Archie. Yes, I said, Miss Venn. He inclined his head. She will return. She didn't seem eager. She will return, he repeated, because she is frightened, and because she needs me. This wasn't Wolfe being arrogant. This was Wolfe being accurate. When lunch ended, he pushed his plate away, a gesture so clean it might as well have been punctuated with a period, and looked at me. Archie, retrieve the basket from the safe. Sure, I said, but no opening jars. If the killer laced any of this, I'm not dying because someone wanted Fritz to go light on the paprika. Wolfe made a sound that might have been a snort. Bring it. I fetched the basket and set it gently on his desk. He inspected the printed ivory label again, turning it carefully with fingertip and thumb. This, he murmured, is no simple courtesy gift. Someone exerted effort, someone with access to rare goods and the intelligence to use them improvidently. Someone who knew Fritz, I added. Wolfe's jaw tightened again. We both looked up when the front bell rang at 2:18. Fritz went to answer it, but immediately returned as he must, escorting none other than Claudia Venn. She still looked delicate, but now she had the air of a woman who had walked through a storm wearing silk shoes. Her gloves were missing. Her hands trembled. Mr. Wolfe, she said, I have the retainer. She held out an envelope. Wolfe's brows rose. You are prepared, then? I must be, she whispered. Philip is dead, and whoever killed him, they won't stop. Wolfe leaned forward, his bulk shifting like a landslide considering its first move. Madam, someone has employed cuisine as a weapon. We shall see if their palate withstands scrutiny. The way he said it, you'd think he was planning to roast the murderer and garnish them with parsley. Claudia sagged with relief. Wolfe gestured. Archie, take the envelope. I did, and with that simple act, the case officially landed in the laps of Nero Wolfe and Archie Goodwin, where murderers come to be handled like pests in a well-run garden. Wolfe closed his eyes, not in exhaustion, but in decision. We begin, he said, and that was the final word. The evening light drifting through the office windows had the weary tint of a Manhattan day that had passed judgment on everyone except us, and even we were on borrowed time. At 6:14 p.m., Wolfe finally lowered himself into the red leather chair with the sort of sigh a man uses when he intends to think too hard for anyone's comfort, including his own. I'd just finished typing up notes on Darnell's penthouse disaster, and the keys were still warm under my fingers when Wolfe spoke. "Archie," he said, "we require the ledger." "Sure," I answered. "I'll go to the Afterlife Records department and see if Darnell left it under P for poison." He closed his eyes, slowly, with feeling, the way a person might close them after being told his lunch hour was being cut by 10 seconds. "Summon Mr. Pantzer." Saul Pantzer could find a missing planet in under 2 hours, so I didn't argue. I phoned him, gave the essentials, and he said, "On my way," before I'd even finished the sentence. Efficiency like that should be bottled and sold. At 6:27, Fritz appeared in the doorway, holding 2 drinks with ceremonial gravity, ginger ale for me, chilled beer for Wolfe. He delivered them like tributes to an emperor. Fritz's face was calmer than the night before, but his eyes were still unsettled water. He said nothing, because Fritz never says anything during job talk unless the house is on fire, and even then he'd knock politely. Wolfe lifted his beer, inspecting the frost on the glass. "Thank you, Fritz." "My pleasure, sir," Fritz murmured, retreating. I took a sip of ginger ale and leaned back, crossing my legs. "So, boss, our roster of would-be spice killers includes a temperamental chef, a wealthy patron with social claws, and a rival club owner with ego issues. A real buffet." Wolfe ignored my culinary humour, which I considered a professional slight. Claudia Venn had provided 3 names of people with access to Darnell's registry. André Voltan, the kind of chef who threw knives when soufflés fell. Eloise Brackett, who could buy and sell half of Manhattan without rumpling her pearls. And Marco Vendrick, founder of a competing gourmet club and known carrier of terminal ambition. "At least the suspects have flavour," I added. Wolfe's eyelids twitched. "Archie." "Just keeping morale high." He grunted. At 6:41 the bell rang. I answered it. Saul Pantzer strolled in, hat low, steps soft as a rumour. He had a folded square of paper in his pocket and a faint scent of cold night air clinging to his coat. Wolfe greeted him with a nod. "Report." Saul sat, crossed one ankle neatly over the opposite knee, and unfolded the paper with careful fingers. "The ledger didn't walk off on its own," he said. "It was removed before Darnell died. I found evidence in the trash chute at Marco Vendrick's building." That woke Wolfe up 2 inches taller. Saul handed Wolfe the torn page, a jagged sheet with neat handwriting cataloguing rare ingredients used in European courts. One line circled in pencil: monk's pepper extract, historical applications, incapacitating agents. I let out a low whistle. Well, that pairs nicely with a dead treasurer. Saul nodded once. Vendrick tried to burn the rest of the pages, but this one survived the attempt. Poorly executed job, probably rushed. Wolfe examined the torn sheet as though it were a relic excavated from Pompeii. "Excellent," he murmured. "Mr. Pantzer, you have again demonstrated exemplary acuity," which was Wolfe's version of rolling out a red carpet. Saul accepted it with a tilt of his head. I crossed my arms. "You know," I said, "it's been 6 months since you said anything nice about me." Wolfe didn't look at me. "Your usefulness is systemic, not episodic." "I'll embroider that on a pillow," I said. "Maybe sell copies." Saul's lips twitched, which for Saul was the equivalent of slapping his knee and roaring with laughter. We spent the next 20 minutes discussing Vandrick's possible angles. He had motive, rivalry, access, and a hunger to pull the rug out from under the culinary circle. But Voltan wasn't off the hook either. A hot-headed chef with a history of tantrums could poison someone out of theatrical principle. Or Eloise Brackett might be hiding something under all those pearls besides the weight of her checkbook. Still, only one of them had torn ledger pages in his trash. Wolfe leaned back, belly settling like a landed dirigible. "Archie, record this." I swiveled to the typewriter. "Shoot." Suspects: André Voltan. Volatile, unpredictable, capable of impulsive violence. Eloise Brackett. Wealthy, discreet, socially adroit. Marco Vendrick. Ambitious, competitive, willing to wound rivals. "Noted," I said, adding a line. "Vendrick also has trash habits that would embarrass a raccoon." Wolfe scowled but didn't correct it. At 7:12 the office door opened without ceremony. Inspector Kramer stood there, hat in hand, cigar in the other, wearing the look of a man who had been force-fed bureaucracy all day and found the flavour disappointing. Oddly, he wasn't boiling, just simmering. "Evening," he said gruffly. "Inspector," Wolfe answered, voice smooth as custard. Kramer stepped in, glancing at Saul, then at the torn ledger sheet in Wolfe's hand. "Mind if I see that?" "You may not," Wolfe said, "but Archie may show you." I held it up for Kramer. He inspected it, frowning. "This matches the description of the missing ledger pages the lab said we should look for." "Then you are welcome," Wolfe said. Kramer blew out air. "You found this?" "Mr. Panzer did," Wolfe corrected. Kramer nodded once, reluctantly respectful. "I'll give you this. It's good work, but don't interfere with the chain of evidence. Don't touch anything else you shouldn't." Wolfe stiffened visibly. "I never interfere with the chain of evidence, Inspector. I circumvent ignorance." Kramer snorted. "Just don't circumvent the DA." He turned to go, tired, not angry. At the doorway he paused. "All right, Wolfe, I'll wait for your report. So far you haven't made a mess." He exited without a slam, which was practically a hug. Saul rose. "I'll get back to work." "Thank you, Mr. Panzer," Wolfe said. Saul tipped his hat and slipped out like vapour. When the door closed, Wolfe tapped the torn ledger page with a single finger. "Archie." "Yes, sir?" "We must meet Marco Vendrick." "In person?" I asked. "In this office," Wolfe corrected sharply. "I will not go to him." "Then I'll arrange it," I said, rising, "but Vendrick strikes me as the type who doesn't like being summoned." "Pfui!" That was Wolfe's seal of confidence. I grabbed my hat and coat. Before I left, I glanced at him. He was staring down at the circled words monk's pepper extract, like they were a personal insult to his culinary morals. "Anything else?" I asked. "Yes." His eyes shifted, small and dark. "Do not allow Mr. Vendrick to unsettle you." I grinned. "If anyone's going to unsettle anyone, I'll take the first turn." "Archie," Wolfe warned, "do not be an ass." "Never on purpose," I promised. He waved me off, the ritual dismissal, and reached for the bell cord to summon Fritz for dinner at 8. Casework would resume after the plates were cleared and the orchids rested for the night. But for now, Wolfe had declared war, and somewhere in Manhattan, Marco Vendrick was about to find out what it meant when Nero Wolfe wanted a meeting. When a man like Marco Vendrick rings your bell at 7:42 in the evening, you don't assume he came to sell cookies. I opened the door and got a faceful of hauteur wrapped in a charcoal suit so sharp it could have sliced Fritz's best Linzer taut. Vendrick was tall, bony in the elegant way of vultures, and his expression suggested I was someone who emptied ashtrays for a living. "I have an appointment with Mr. Wolfe," he said, voice clipped, like each word cost him money. "No appointment," I replied, "just a summons. Think of this as jury duty for people who use truffles as weapons." He sniffed, stepped inside, and swept past like the hallway was beneath his tax bracket. I escorted him to the office where Wolfe was at his desk beneath a cone of warm lamplight. Evening shadows pooled in the corners, thick and expectant. Wolfe barely moved. "Mr. Vendrick, sit." Vendrick chose the yellow chair, crossing his legs with the grace of someone who practiced for mirrors. He folded his gloves precisely. "I understand you have certain concerns about my involvement with Philip Darnell." "That is correct," Wolfe said. "You discarded pages from his ledger." Vendrick exhaled a soft laugh, the kind you hear from a man who wants to sound amused while measuring escape routes. "Irrelevant scraps, notes of no consequence. Darnell was obsessive. He wrote everything down. Some of it needed pruning." "Pruning," I repeated, "like you do with inconvenient witnesses." Vendrick turned his head slowly, like a snake deciding whether I was edible. "Your assistant is insolent." "Systemically," Wolfe murmured. "Proceed." A muscle near Vendrick's jaw twitched. "I came here to clarify a misunderstanding. The culinary circle is troubled at the moment. Philip was preparing to publicize certain internal disputes. I removed draft notes to prevent embarrassment. Nothing more." Wolfe's fingers tented. "What disputes?" Vendrick hesitated. It wasn't long, but long enough to give me an urge to lean forward and instigate. "There has been," he said finally, "a pattern of sabotage. Certain chefs, competitors, have found their ingredients tampered with during club events." I raised a brow. "Sabotage? Sabotage with what? Salt swapped for sugar? or the kind that sends a man to the morgue? Vendrick ignored me. Wolfe did not. Explain. Vendrick's tone cooled. Ruined dishes, spoiled broths, fruit lacquer sprayed on meats. Nothing fatal, but reputations can die far more easily than men. Darnell was compiling evidence. Someone feared it. His gaze sharpened. Someone with access. To Monk's pepper extract? I asked. Vendrick's stare flicked to me again, this time tighter. Philip experimented with obscure ingredients. He was sloppy. That's not what his notes suggested, I said. Wolfe raised a hand, a single finger. That was enough to halt me mid-breath. He addressed Vendrick. Mr. Panzer discovered the torn ledger page in your trash. Vendrick didn't flinch. And I told you why. Darnell's registry was an obsession. Nothing in those draft pages implicated me. Convenient, I said. Everything that should exist disappears. Everything that shouldn't exist shows up in your trash chute. Vendrick's voice dropped an octave. Mr. Goodwin, I'm granting your employer an opportunity to avoid embarrassment. Oh? I leaned back. Should we send flowers? My meaning, Vendrick said, is that this matter is better left undisturbed. The circle has powerful members, influential, and if I were Mr. Wolfe, I would consider the welfare of his chef. Accidents happen. I stood so fast the chair nudged the rug. That's it. You're leaving. Vendrick remained seated, simply observing me with the faint curiosity of a man watching an elevator out of order. Threats are unpleasant, Mr. Goodwin. I dislike them as much as anyone. Wolfe's voice sliced through the air. Mr. Goodwin, desist. I froze. Wolfe didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. That single command snapped the office into stillness. He turned to Vendrick. Sir, if you imagine you can intimidate me by implying harm to Mr. Brenner, you are deranged. Archie, sit. I sat. Vendrick's eyelids narrowed a fraction. There is no threat, merely advice. And here is mine, Wolfe said, and the timbre in his voice chilled even me. Leave my house, and if any shadow falls upon Mr. Brenner, I shall take it as proof of your culpability. A current of menace charged the air. Even Vendrick felt it. He uncrossed his legs, stood, smoothed his sleeves. I misjudged your temperament, he said quietly. You misjudge everything, Wolfe replied. Vendrick glanced at me once more, assessing, calculating, and walked out. I escorted him, making sure he didn't decide to trip on his way down the steps. When I returned to the office, Wolfe was gripping the chair arms hard enough to dimple the leather. That was his version of trembling. You handled that coolly, I said. Phooey, he scowled. The man is a fool. Dangerous one, I said. And subtle. He didn't threaten Fritz directly, just implied he could be collateral. Wolfe's eyelids drooped halfway in a dangerous squint. Archie. Yes? Mr. Brenner must not be left alone. No argument here. The phone rang at 8:03. I answered. Goodwin. Kramer's voice came through, heavy with caution. Goodwin. You had Vendrick there. That's privileged information, I said pleasantly. But sure. Kramer exhaled a thick breath. Listen carefully. Vendrick's got friends with deeper pockets than a magician. Pressure from upstairs. If Wolfe pushes him too hard, it'll get messy. Thanks for the bedtime story. Archie, Kramer snapped, tired, not angry. I'm telling you this because Wolfe won't listen to me. Keep him from poking that hornet's nest. Inspector, Wolfe never pokes anything. He dissects it. Well, tell him to dissect gently, and keep Fritz close. He hung up before I could respond. I relayed the essentials. Wolfe listened, jaw tight, then dismissed it with a flick of his hand. Politics are irrelevant. Murder is not. That's why he warned you. Inspector Kramer, Wolfe said with a grudging sigh, is a competent man navigating an incompetent system, but he errs in assuming intimidation will dissuade me. He reached for the bell cord, dinner at 8, and tugged. Fritz appeared, precisely on cue, with the first course. His hands were steady, but his eyes still held a lingering shadow. I watched Wolfe watching him. There was something in Wolfe's gaze, not softness, but steel shielding something softer. When Fritz exited, Wolfe spoke in a low, tight voice I'd only heard once or twice in my years with him. Archie. Yes, sir. If anyone threatens Mr. Brenner again, anyone, I expect to hear of it immediately. You will, I said. He nodded once. sharp as a gavel strike. Vendrick had made a mistake tonight. He thought Wolfe was immovable stone, but he forgot something important. Stone cracks only under impossible pressure, and Wolfe had just chosen his line in the sand. Dinner arrived, and the case turned darker. The moment I stepped into Eloise Brackett's penthouse, I knew I should have charged Wolfe double. The place glowed like a chandelier showroom run by a tyrant with unlimited funds. Every surface shimmered, every crystal tray sparkled, and every guest wore an expression suggesting they wouldn't recognize a real meal unless it begged for mercy. A jazz trio in the corner twinkled out something smooth and expensive, and waiters floated past with flutes of champagne so delicate they might shatter if you breathed on them sideways. It was the kind of party where society glittered out of habit, and no one ate more than a teaspoon, lest pleasure ruin their posture. I drifted through the crowd, noting faces I'd seen in Claudia's files and others with profiles sharp enough to julienne carrots. Eloise herself stood near the balcony, all pearls and hauteur, laughing too loudly at something a hedge fund type said. I kept my distance. Wolfe wanted intel on alliances, rivalries, and who might kill over an underseasoned risotto, not on the state of Eloise Brackett's social calendar. The culinary motif of the evening was elevated tastes, which meant half the food looked like it had been sculpted by Swiss watchmakers, and the other half smelled like someone's grandmother had been offended, and threading through all of it, an undercurrent of tension. Rival chefs watching one another carefully, society members murmuring behind chiffon sleeves. I'd seen boxing matches with less menace. At 8:19 p.m., a small commotion began near the tasting table. André Voltan, the hot-tempered chef with a track record of throwing knives for emphasis, had arrived. He cut through the room like a buzzsaw on a victory lap, sampling dishes with theatrical disdain. Watching him was like watching a fuse wander around in search of dynamite. I meandered close enough to overhear him criticizing a foie gras torchon as soulless as an accountant's handshake, typical Voltan. But then he paused at a small dish prepared by Claudia Venn, a delicate bite of herbed custard meant to showcase rare spices. Claudia, who had been hovering near the piano, stiffened when she saw him reach for it. Voltan lifted the spoon, sniffed dramatically, and swallowed. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then the chandelier metaphorically cracked. Voltan lurched forward, coughing once, hard, and grabbing the edge of the table like he meant to uproot it. Foam flecked the corner of his mouth. Then he collapsed sideways into an artfully arranged pyramid of pastry shells, taking the dignity of the entire party down with him. Screams followed. Screams always do. The jazz trio stopped mid-chord. Glass shattered somewhere. Someone shouted for brandy as if Voltan needed to be marinated on the spot. I knelt beside him, checking his pulse, thready but present, and leaned close. His eyes fluttered open for a breath. Not meant, he gasped. Not meant for me. Then he passed out cold. Well, that narrowed the field. The killer wasn't incompetent, just unlucky. I scanned the room. Claudia stood frozen near the piano, face bloodless. But what struck me was this. She hadn't gone near Fritz's spice basket. Not once. Whatever she'd prepared tonight came from her own supplies. Her shock wasn't theatrical. It was the genuine kind that makes knees buckle. At 8:23, the elevator doors banged open and Inspector Kramer came barreling in with EMTs behind him. He looked like a man 2 hours past his last tolerable moment. His cigar was unlit, building rules, but it chewed on his lower lip anyway. "What the hell now, Goodwin?" he barked, though the bark lacked venom. "Chef down," I said, foaming. Monk's pepper derivative, if I had to bet. Kramer crouched, sniffed the air, and grunted. "Damn it. Wolfe said this mess would spread." He signaled the EMTs. "Get him to the hospital." They lifted Voltan onto a stretcher. Claudia approached timidly, wringing her gloves. I don't understand," she murmured. He only had a spoonful. The custard, it was harmless. Kramer pinned her with a stare. "Lady, nothing's harmless tonight. Stay where I can see you." I stepped in. "Easy, Kramer." She didn't go near Fritz's basket, and she looked ready to faint before Voltan hit the floor. "That's supposed to clear her," he snapped. But tired or not, he softened a trace. "I'll sort it." As the EMTs hauled the stretcher out, Voltan suddenly twitched. His eyes flickered open just long enough for one last whisper. "Not me." Then they whisked him away. The party dissolved like a bad soufflé. Guests streamed for the elevator, muttering about scandal, toxicity, and ruined linens. Eloise Brackett wailed at a waiter to collect insurance forms. The jazz trio quietly packed up, deciding music had no place in a room that had seen foam come out of a man's mouth. I surveyed the chaos. If Wolfe could have seen it, he would have quoted Horace or demanded beer. Probably both. Speaking of Wolfe, I stepped into a quiet corner and called the brownstone. Wolfe answered after 2 rings, unusual for him, which meant he'd been hovering near the phone. "Report," he demanded. "Voltan's down," I said. "Monk's pepper, same as Darnell. He's alive, barely. Said the poison wasn't meant for him." There was a pause. Wolfe inhaled sharply. "Confound it, Archie. You attended an event with potential danger and no police escort?" I blinked. "You sent me here." "I did not send you," he said sternly. "I required information. You chose to obtain it recklessly." "Oh, come on. If Kramer had assigned me a bodyguard, you'd have protested chain of command." "That is irrelevant," Wolfe growled. "Your safety is—" He stopped himself. "Essential to this investigation." "Essential." That was Wolfe for affectionate. "Relax," I said. "I only got splashed with custard. Voltan took the hit." "That," Wolfe said darkly, "is not reassuring." He exhaled, long and rumbling. "Return immediately. I must think." "Yes, sir." I hung up. Claudia approached, pale as fresh linens. "Mr. Goodwin, please tell Mr. Wolfe, I couldn't. I'll tell him you were shocked," I said. "For now, go home, stay with someone, and don't touch anything edible unless you watched it grow." She managed a tiny nod. By the time I got back to the brownstone, 9:11 p.m., Wolfe was pacing, actual pacing, 3 whole steps behind his desk, back and forth. For Wolfe, that was the bodily equivalent of screaming into a pillow. "Archie," he snapped, "detail, all of it." I gave him the full run, the penthouse, the glitter, the tension, Voltan collapsing, the foam, his whisper, Claudia's panic, Kramer's arrival, everything. Wolfe listened without blinking. When I finished, he sat slowly, as if lowering a freight load onto his chair. His fingers tapped once on the desk. "The dish," he murmured, "prepared by Miss Venn." "She looked blindsided," I said. "If you're fishing for guilt, she doesn't swim like that." He scowled. "Archie, attend. The poisoner intended to silence Darnell and implicate Mr. Brenner. But now, their rashness has exposed them. Someone miscalculated." "That's bad for them," I said. "Good for us." "Both," Wolfe corrected. "A killer who errs is a killer growing desperate." He reached for the bell cord, tugged it, and waited. Fritz appeared within seconds, bearing Wolfe's evening beer with apprehensive precision. Wolfe accepted the drink but didn't touch it. He stared into space, face carved from granite. "Archie," he said quietly, "we are not merely hunting a murderer. We are combating a fanatic." "Well," I said, easing into my chair, "let's hope they don't have a third act planned." Wolfe's eyes lifted, dark, intent. "They do," he said. "They always do." And that was the hook that wrapped the night around our throats. By the time the rain started ticking against the brownstone windows like impatient fingers, the office looked like the inside of a filing cabinet that had exploded in a moment of passion. Papers were everywhere, Saul's careful printouts, Ori's aggressive scribbles, Fred's blocky notes, and my own elegant typing, which deserved its own museum wing. Wolfe sat behind his desk, glowering at the piles as though they were weeds he would gladly uproot, if only that didn't involve standing. It was 11:43 p.m. Fritz had long since gone to bed, and even the city outside felt done for the night. The lamps threw long shadows across the rug, giving the room that quiet, noir solemnity we get only when Wolfe is in full cerebral boil. Saul Pantzer had been first to arrive with the goods: timelines, testimony, club rosters, and a stack of membership codes from the culinary circle. After him came Ori, proudly carrying gossip disguised as intelligence, followed by Fred Durkin, dripping from the rain and offering a pile of statements that read like interviews conducted with polite muggers. It was my job to turn this stew into a digestible dish. I typed, filed, sorted, typed again, and by midnight had compiled a partial reconstruction of Darnell's missing ledger, an organized chaos of ingredient orders, delivery records, registry drafts, and cross-references regarding rare substances. Wolfe watched my progress with the same expression he used when judging an underseasoned cassoulet. The pattern emerges, Wolfe finally said. It better, I replied. I've rearranged this stuff more often than Fritz rearranges his spice rack. Saul leaned over the desk. 3 people, he murmured. Only 3 had access to the experimental ingredients and the promotional baskets distributed under Claudia's name. I tapped the 3 names on my pages. Claudia Venn, Eloise Brackett, Marco Vendrick. Fred scratched his chin. Brackett. Thought she hated that Darnell fella. Correction, Saul said quietly. She didn't. Her banker and her bookkeeper both confirmed she was funding his historical cookbook. Quietly. I blinked. So the rivalry story was a red herring? Apparently, Saul nodded. Wolfe made a small, satisfied sound like someone had brought him a competent appetizer. Good. One irrelevance disposed of. I stretched my back and sat on the arm of my chair. So we've narrowed the suspect list to the secretary, the mogul, and the man who thinks sabotage is a form of professional courtesy. Wolfe shot me a look. Archie, if frivolity were fatal, you would be in constant peril. Maybe, I said, but at least I know how to cook something more complicated than scrambled eggs. His head snapped up. Sir, do not provoke me with culinary slander. My refusal to cook is a matter of principle, not incapacity. Name one dish you could manage, I challenged, one real dish. I could produce a béarnaise sauce of impeccable character, I grinned. You couldn't identify a béarnaise if it introduced itself wearing a name tag. Wolfe inhaled like a man preparing to deliver an entire paragraph of rebuke. Instead, he exhaled and said, Your comedic impulses are a plague. That's why you keep me, I said. To balance the room. He reached for a stack of notes and ignored me, which was his version of conceding the point. Saul stood, ready to depart. You'll want Vendrick next. Indeed, Wolfe said. Thank you, Mr. Panzer. Saul nodded once and glided out like a rumour fading. Ori lingered, rearranging his tie. If you need me to lean on Brackett, no, Wolfe snapped. You will remain observant, not intrusive. Ori wilted a little and left. Fred followed with a respectful nod. Now it was just Wolfe, me, the rain, and the half-assembled skeleton of a killer's motive. I gathered the final notes and laid them on Wolfe's blotter. So, we have our 3. Claudia, who's nervous enough to unravel if someone raises their voice. Vendrick, who probably dreams in ledger entries and hostile takeovers. And Brackett, who just lost her motive. Wolfe nodded. Correct. What next? Pressure. I snorted. That's your specialty. He drew himself up, the chair creaking in protest. Archie, write this. The killer possesses knowledge of historical culinary toxins and contemporary distribution channels. This narrows the field drastically. The next step requires enticement. I typed it quickly. At 1:07 a.m., I narrated aloud, Wolfe declares he's ready to set a trap. Do not editorialize, he warned. I added a neat line break just to annoy him. The phone rang at 12:56 a.m. Wolfe glared at it as though offended that anyone dared summon him after hours. I answered. Goodwin. Kramer's voice, low, hoarse, and, for once, not immediately annoyed. Goodwin. Put Wolfe on. I handed over the receiver. Wolfe braced his elbow on the desk as though it were necessary armour. Yes, Inspector. On the other end I heard Kramer sigh, a long one that had been building since Prohibition. We ran your list. The reconstruction you people did tonight. It's closer than anything my men have. Wolfe's eyelids flickered, and for a fraction of a second he almost looked pleased. Almost. I see, he said, voice cool as marble. But, Kramer added sharply, don't let that go to your head. I'm not giving you carte blanche. Wolfe growled faintly. I do not require your indulgence, Inspector. That's what scares me. Goodwin's one thing, you're another. Don't push this too far. I will push precisely as far as necessary. Kramer muttered something about ulcers. Then, fine, keep me informed. Good night. He hung up without drama, which coming from Kramer was practically a warm handshake. Wolfe settled heavily into his chair, the corners of his mouth tightening in a way I'd seen exactly twice before. Once when the maitre d' ruined his roasted suckling pig, and once when he solved a murder before breakfast. You enjoyed that, I said. Fui. But his satisfaction was unmistakable. The rain intensified, drumming against the windows. The office felt smaller, filled with the electricity of a case that was finally congealing into shape. Wolfe tapped the reconstructed ledger pages. Archie. Present. This has enough coherence for a trap. I straightened. What kind? One requiring bait. I blinked. Which exotic delicacy gets that honor? You, I groaned. Why is it always me? Why not Ori? Ori, Wolfe said, is decorative, not catalytic. Fred? Too stolid. Saul? If I needed competence without charisma. But here, the killer must believe they can manipulate or follow you. You are ideal. I rubbed my forehead dramatically. I'm flattered. Deeply. Truly. This is the kind of validation a man dreams about. Wolfe ignored my theatrics. Tomorrow we will arrange a meeting. You will attend. The killer will reveal themselves. Just like that? Just like that. Outside, sirens wailed distantly. Some other poor fool in some other poor mystery. But inside, the brownstone crackled with tension. The trap had shape. The ledger was reborn. And Wolfe had officially selected me as the worm on the hook. I leaned back and stretched. Fine. But if I end up poisoned, I expect a memorial plaque. You will not end up poisoned. You sound confident. I am, Wolfe said. You're too irritating to kill successfully. Heartwarming, I said. He waved a dismissive hand, the ritual cue that the night's work was done. I began collecting papers, stacking them into tidy piles that mocked the earlier chaos. As I finished, Wolfe muttered, half to himself, half to me, "Be prepared, Archie. The killer will not let their advantage slip twice." Outside, thunder rumbled. Inside, Wolfe made plans. And I, apparently, was the next course on someone's deadly menu. If there's one thing I dislike more than being used as bait, it's being used as bait before breakfast. But Wolfe had declared it necessary, and when the mountain speaks, the molehill fetches his hat. So, at 11:17 the next morning, I found myself in a midtown cafe that had once aspired to Paris, but settled comfortably into Manhattan gloom. The pastries looked like they had been baked during the Hoover administration and kept on retainer ever since. The air smelled of cigarette smoke, burnt espresso, and desperation. 3 things I've grown intimately familiar with in my line of work. Claudia Venn entered quietly, shoulders tight beneath a soft grey coat, gloves clutched like she feared they'd bolt. She spotted me in the corner booth and hurried over. "Mr. Goodwin, thank you. I didn't know where else to—" "Sit," I said gently. "And breathe. You look like a souffle on the verge of collapse." She tried to smile. It didn't stick. "I'm frightened." "That makes 2 of us," I said. "Now talk." The waitress wandered over, pad in hand. I ordered coffee, Claudia ordered tea but didn't touch it. I watched her fingers tremble against the chipped china cup. "Start with Darnell," I prompted. "You said he confronted someone. About what?" Her voice dropped. "He said someone was using the culinary circle as a cover for illegal trades." "Illegal trades of what?" I asked. "Counterfeit saffron? Underground foie gras?" She swallowed. "Rare ingredients. Smuggled. Some banned." "Banned as in contraband," I said. "Or banned because one pinch could send a man to the morgue?" She said nothing, which wasn't the same as denying it. "Claudia," I pressed, "whose name did Darnell mention?" She shook her head hard. "If I tell you, I'm condemning myself. You saw what happened to Philip and Voltan. Someone in that club will kill to keep their reputation polished. And yet you came here." She stared into her tea, hands clenched. "Because I'm next." That got my attention. "Explain." "Yesterday," she whispered, "someone left a note under my door, no signature. It said, 'Stop talking,' but I never told anyone anything." Her breath hitched. "Which means someone knows I know." "That narrows the field," I muttered. "Someone's shadowing your guilt." She looked up sharply. "Mr. Goodwin, I'm not guilty." "Then you'll have to trust me enough to finish your thought. Who did Darnell confront?" She hesitated. For a full minute she looked like she might crack. Then she finally said, barely audible, "He confronted someone powerful, someone with connections far outside the gourmet world." "Name." She flinched. No. If I say it aloud." I leaned back. "Then keep it in your pocket for now, but listen carefully. Wolfe is building something, a trap. If you're innocent, the safest place to stand is behind him." A tremor went through her. I want to believe that. You should. The only thing Wolfe hates more than murder is someone messing with Fritz, and someone tried to poison Fritz. She nodded, lips trembling, but then something shifted. Her gaze darted past me toward the front windows. I glanced reflexively. 2 men in dark coats stood outside, not talking, not smoking, not enjoying the scenery, watching. "Friends of yours?" I asked. Claudia shook her head violently. "No, no." Our waitress returned with the check. Claudia jumped. The 2 men leaned toward the glass for 1 second too long. "Listen," I said quietly. "Get up. Leave by the side door. Walk to the subway. Don't look back. I'll call you later." "But go. Now." I slid out of the booth and gave her cover as she slipped toward the restrooms. The 2 men stiffened. I turned, blocking their line of sight. One stepped forward. Broad shoulders, narrow eyes, a face sculpted by bad habits and worse decisions. "Nice day for coffee," I said cheerfully. He didn't answer. His buddy circled to flank me. So that's how we were playing it. I headed to the alley beside the cafe. They followed without pretense. The moment the door closed behind me, a fist came flying. I dodged, barely, and caught the edge of a trash bin with my hip. Elegant it wasn't. The guy swung again, but I blocked and jabbed him hard in the ribs. He grunted. His friend lunged at me, aiming to pin my arms. I twisted free and kicked a knee just enough to sting. But 2-on-1 alley brawls aren't the kind of thing I list under Archie's favourite pastimes, and things were headed toward messy when a shadow detached itself from the far wall. Saul Panzer. No theatrics, no warnings. His hand shot out, grabbed one man's wrist, twisted sharply, and sent him sprawling. The other turned, panicked, swung wildly, and Saul stepped aside with a movement so economical it bordered on insulting. One precise elbow to the jaw, and the guy folded like poorly cooked pasta. Saul straightened his coat. "You all right?" "I was handling it," I lied. Saul didn't bother answering that. "Wolfe will want a full account." "Oh, he'll get one. And a lecture." Saul helped me check the men's pockets, nothing identifying, then melted back into the shadows, silent as a rumour. I retrieved my hat from a puddle, may it rest in peace, confirmed the goons weren't planning an encore, and limped back toward the brownstone. When I pushed open the office door at 1:06 p.m, Wolfe looked up from a book with the expression of a man seeing a priceless vase fall off a table. "Good heavens!" "Hi," I said. "You should see the other guys." "Fritz!" Wolfe thundered, tugging the bell cord with enough force to threaten its structural integrity. Fritz appeared instantly, eyes widening at my state. Wolfe snapped, "A hot meal, immediately, and broth first." "Certainly," Fritz said, already vanishing. I sat down, wincing. Wolfe glared at me like I'd deliberately gotten assaulted to ruin his afternoon. "You went alone," he accused. "I had backup. Saul dropped in." "He should not have needed to." Wolfe's voice was low and tight. "Archie, damnation, you are not to provoke danger without strategy." I didn't provoke it. I was born irresistible. Phooey. But he was shaken. And in Wolfe, shaken looks a lot like fury. I recounted the cafe meeting, Claudia's panic, the illegal trades, the confrontation she hinted at, the men tailing her, and the near brawl. Wolfe listened with both eyebrows lowered enough to shade the desk. "She knows something," he said finally. "Something central." "Then tell her to spill it." "She will," he muttered. "Fear is a better solvent than interrogation." Before I could answer, the phone rang at 1:39. I picked up. Claudia's voice came through in a terrified whisper. "Mr. Goodwin, someone was rifling through my apartment. I heard them. I was too afraid to move." "Where are you now?" "In the hallway. I ran out." "Stay there. Wolfe will—" "I can't stay here. Please, help me." I covered the receiver. "Wolfe?" He extended a hand for the phone. I gave it to him. "Miss Venn," he said, voice softened in a way few ever hear. "You will come here, at once." A trembling breath answered. "You will remain under my protection," Wolfe said firmly. "No harm will reach you in this house." He hung up, and for a moment the office felt very still. Wolfe turned to me. "Archie, prepare the front room. She will stay here until this is resolved." I stood. "Yes, sir." And that was how the brownstone gained one terrified secretary, and how our case gained the spark it needed to explode. By the time 8 o'clock rolled around, Wolfe's office looked less like a room and more like the stage of a courtroom drama, directed by a man who despises unnecessary movement. Fritz had polished the brass lamp bases until you could see your future in them. The chairs were arranged in evenly spaced rows that would have impressed a military inspector. Wolfe sat behind his desk like a sedentary judge carved from expensive stone. I stood off to the side, ready to collect statements, block lunges, or field insults depending on how the evening went. Our guests arrived in staggered pairs of footsteps. Claudia came first, pale and jumpy, glancing at every shadow like it owed her money. Eloise Brackett followed, swathed in mink and disdain. Then Vendrick strode in with the confidence of a man who believes laws are suggestions to be edited. Kramer arrived last, coat unbuttoned, cigar unlit but clenched between his teeth, his eyes carrying the kind of fatigue that gets its mail forwarded. "Wolfe," he grunted, "this better be worth dragging me out before dinner." Wolfe inclined his head. "Inspector, I rarely waste anyone's time but my own." "Phooey," I muttered under my breath. Wolfe cocked an eyebrow without looking at me, the domestic equivalent of a cease and desist. Everyone settled uneasily. The rain outside had paused, leaving behind a heavy, theatrical silence. The lighting fell in clean arcs from the ceiling, drawing sharp contrasts across faces, perfect for watching guilt bloom. Wolfe folded his hands. "Ladies and gentlemen, I have summoned you because the murders of Philip Darnell and the attempted murder of Mr. Voltan now admit of coherent interpretation." Eloise gasped slightly. Vendrick crossed his legs. Claudia flinched. Kramer said nothing, but the crease between his eyebrows deepened. Wolfe continued, "The toxin employed is no simple irritant. Monastic pepper serves as an aromatic only when used in minute quantities. Extracted, concentrated, and refined, it becomes lethal. Its preparation requires specialized equipment, heating retorts, filtration glass, a precision grinder." Claudia's breath hitched. Wolfe's gaze moved to her. "Equipment, Miss Venn, which is found only in one office at the Culinary Circle." Eloise turned in shock. Vendrick's eyes narrowed. Kramer's hand stopped halfway to his coat pocket. Claudia stared at Wolfe like he'd slapped her. I don't run a laboratory. It's for testing spices. Quality control." Wolfe raised one finger. Silence descended like a curtain. He nodded at me. My cue. I stepped forward and handed Kramer a neatly folded photostat, one I had acquired legally through a cooperative clerk at the Circle, and a signature from their legal liaison. "Inspector," I said, "this is a reproduction of ledger entries compiled by Darnell. The originals are missing, but the discrepancies were clear enough for anyone familiar with his handwriting." Claudia's voice cracked. "You forged the accusation." "No," I said, "you did." Wolfe continued smoothly. "Miss Venn altered Darnell's ledger to conceal her own activities. Not murder, yet, but smuggling, exotic ingredients, rare substances prohibited by import law." He gestured toward Vendrick and Eloise. "These items arrived inside innocuous shipments addressed to the Culinary Circle." Kramer swore under his breath. "You've got proof of that?" "The photostat," Wolfe said. "And Mr. Goodwin secured confirmation from your own offices, Inspector." I added, "Darnell discovered the alterations. He confronted someone. Claudia told me as much." Claudia shook her head violently. "I never killed anyone. Yes, I changed some entries, but I didn't hurt Philip." Vendrick smirked. "Your motives are obvious. You were in over your head." "You shut up," I snapped. He didn't. Wolfe leaned forward slightly, a monumental gesture in Wolfland. "Miss Venn, your dishonesty endangered you, but Darnell's murder required precision beyond your skills. However," his eyes grew colder, "you were present the night he died." She recoiled. "No," Kramer's head jerked up. "Wolfe, you better have something concrete." "I do," Wolfe said calmly. "The anonymous call at midnight warned Mr. Brenner not to drink anything. That call was made by Darnell." Archie recognized the panic in his voice. The line cut abruptly, consistent with violent interruption. Claudia choked out, "That doesn't involve me." "On the contrary," Wolfe replied crisply, "you left your building at 11:46 p.m., as verified by the doorman. You followed Darnell. That is why someone rifled your apartment afterward. They feared you had evidence." Eloise gasped. Vendrick shifted, eyes sharpening. Kramer's jaw set. Claudia sagged into her chair. Tears welled. I followed him because he was going to expose me. I told him I was done, that I'd stop handling the shipments, but he said he'd reveal everything anyway. Yes, I followed him. To plead. I never reached his door. When I got there, I heard something break. I panicked and ran. I didn't poison him. I swear I didn't. Kramer exhaled through his nose, a weary sound. If she's telling the truth, someone used her smuggling to hide something bigger. Wolfe nodded. Precisely. Vendrick scoffed. This is absurd. You are constructing fictions. Sit down, Kramer barked, not with anger, but the sharp finality of a man reclaiming authority. Vendrick sat. Wolfe clasped his hands. The smuggling, the forged entries, and the midnight warning point to orchestration. Someone exploited Miss Venn's illicit activities to muddle the motive. They planted poisoned spices in the basket intended for Mr. Brenner, counting on her reputation to draw suspicion. Eloise leapt to her feet. But why frame her? Why Fritz? Wolfe's voice softened dangerously. To wound me. The room chilled. Even Vendrick paused. Wolfe continued. The poisoner sought to destroy credibility, to provoke scandal. But then, he glanced at me, they erred. Voltan was not the intended victim at the tasting. Claudia clasped her chest. Then who? Wolfe's eyes met Vendrick's briefly, then moved on. One of you. Kramer's eyebrows shot up. You're saying the killer's in this room? Yes. Vendrick scoffed again, but less steadily. Eloise looked ready to faint. Claudia looked ready to disappear. You still haven't given me a murderer, Kramer said. Just implications. Wolfe nodded. Of course. I will demonstrate. He gestured toward me. I dimmed the lights slightly per his earlier instruction, dramatic but effective, and Wolfe continued. Miss Brackett is cleared. Her financial support of Darnell contradicts the alleged rivalry. Miss Venn is also cleared of murder. Her guilt lies in smuggling and forgery, but she lacks the expertise to prepare the toxin in its lethal form. Vendrick opened his mouth. Wolfe cut him off with a raised palm. Mr. Vendrick is an opportunist, not a chemist. His involvement lies in disposal of evidence, not preparation of poison. Vendrick stiffened. You overstep. Silence, Wolfe commanded. I am not finished. Kramer leaned forward. Wolfe, if you're narrowing the field, narrow it all the way. Wolfe inhaled. Slow, measured, theatrical. Very well. The killer used Claudia's smuggling as camouflage. They had access to her office. They had technical knowledge of exotic ingredients. They had motive to silence Darnell. The room leaned closer. And, he added, they're in this room now. Claudia whimpered. Eloise trembled. Vendrick's jaw clenched. Kramer barked, Then say it. Wolfe shook his head. Not yet. The final proof is incomplete. One piece remains. He turned to me. Archie, fetch the sealed packet from the safe. I nodded, heart thumping. Vendrick surged to his feet. Wolfe, this is outrageous. Kramer grabbed his arm. Sit down. Wolfe's voice cut through the tension. I assure you, the truth will be evident in moments. The killer attempted to frame Miss Venn. They failed. And now, he paused dramatically, I will demonstrate exactly how. Silence stretched, taut as wire, and that was how the trap began to close. Wolfe glanced at me, eyes gleaming with calm ferocity. Archie, he said quietly, bring it. The room held its breath. The killer held theirs, and the brownstone felt like the epicenter of a storm moments before lightning hits. I returned from the safe with the sealed packet, and the tension in the room tightened like a pulled wire. Everyone was already exactly where they'd been moments earlier. Claudia gripping her gloves, Eloise rigid as polished stone, Vendrick sitting tall and coiled, with Kramer and Stebbins watching from their posts. Fritz hovered by the doorway, unwilling to leave while danger still breathed in the room. Wolfe didn't move. He lifted one hand for silence as I set the packet on his desk, the confrontation that had already begun sharpening into its final decisive moment. He let the quiet settle before sweeping his gaze across the room, weighing each face with the slow, deliberate precision of a man judging a rare ingredient. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, voice even, tonight we conclude an unpleasant matter. Murder, masquerading beneath the veneer of gastronomy. as though culinary skill could disguise criminality. Vendrick smirked. Your pomposity is noted. Wolfe didn't even blink. Mr. Vendrick, your contribution to this evening will consist of listening, not speaking. Kramer muttered. For once, I agree. Wolfe continued. We begin with the spice basket sent to Mr. Brenner. A curious gift, containing rare ingredients certainly, but more importantly, he lifted a photostat, bearing a misprinted label. He handed it to Kramer. Observe the typography, the ligature on the FF, the curvature of the serif. Kramer frowned at it. So? Only one printing firm in Manhattan uses that style, Wolfe said. The firm owned by Mr. Vendrick. Vendrick stiffened. Coincidence? No, Wolfe said sharply. It identifies the source of the basket. You. Eloise gasped softly. Claudia clutched her gloves. Stebbins took a half step forward. Wolfe pressed on. Mr. Vendrick exploited Miss Venn's smuggling arrangements to conceal his own crimes. She transported forbidden ingredients. You used her records to blackmail Darnell, threatening exposure unless he ceased investigating the sabotage within the culinary circle. Vendrick's voice cracked. That is absurd. Silence, Wolfe said, voice like a hammer wrapped in silk. Kramer took the photostat back, brows knit. You're saying he rigged both poisonings? Wolfe nodded. Precisely. Darnell confronted him. Vendrick arranged a midnight meeting. Darnell realized the danger and phoned here, the warning to Fritz. It was cut short when Mr. Vendrick struck him. Claudia shuddered. I heard something break that night. Yes, Wolfe said. The sound of violence. You fled in terror, foolishly believing proximity incriminated you. The colour drained from her cheeks. Wolfe went on. Having killed Darnell, Mr. Vendrick prepared the monk's pepper extract. He placed a prepared vial among the spices Miss Venn distributed. Then he delivered the rigged basket to this house, intending Mr. Brenner to open it and meet his end. Fritz inhaled sharply. Wolfe flicked his eyes toward him, softening for a fraction of a second. Your survival was chance alone, he said. I felt a ripple through my chest, Wolfe protecting his own. But, Wolfe continued, the plan wavered. Mr. Goodwin and I identified the pattern sooner than anticipated, and when the first murder failed to deflect suspicion entirely, Mr. Vendrick acted again, this time publicly. Eloise whispered, Voltan? Yes, the tasting event. Wolfe steepled his fingers. The poison was not intended for Mr. Voltan. He was a theatrical man. He always sampled first. But the dish was prepared for another guest entirely, one whose elimination would distract the circle, mire the investigation, and allow Mr. Vendrick to claim innocence through chaos. Vendrick's composure snapped. This is slander. No, Wolfe said. This is deduction. Kramer straightened. Then let's hear all of it. Wolfe inclined his head. Of course. Mr. Vendrick knew Darnell kept meticulous notes. He entered Miss Venn's office the night before the murder, used her equipment to distill the poison, and returned the apparatus in pristine condition. Then, following the attempted poisoning at the tasting, he ransacked Miss Venn's apartment to retrieve any remaining evidence linking him to Darnell. Claudia looked stricken. I knew someone had been there. You were fortunate, Wolfe said. Mr. Vendrick believed you too frightened to pose a threat. Kramer snapped. Vendrick, you got anything to say before I put cuffs on you? Vendrick shot to his feet. This is a farce. You have no witness, no proof, nothing but the fantasy of a glutton who mistakes obsession for insight. He lunged toward the door. He didn't get far. Stebbins moved first, blocking him with the solidity of a brick wall. Vendrick jerked sideways, straight into Kramer's grip. The inspector twisted his arm with weary efficiency, snapping the handcuffs on with a click that sounded like destiny signing paperwork. Vendrick howled. You can't do this, you arrogant— Save it, Kramer growled. You're done. Stebbins hauled him toward the hall. Eloise exhaled shakily. Claudia dissolved into tears. Fritz crossed himself under his breath, which I'd only seen him do twice. Kramer turned back to Wolfe. Well, hell, he rubbed his jaw. You earned your keep today. Wolfe sniffed. I trust your men will take proper custody of him. They will? Kramer pocketed his cigar. And for what it's worth, Wolfe? Nice work. Wolfe said nothing, but the faintest curl of satisfaction touched his mouth, the Wolfe equivalent of a victory parade. Kramer and Stebbins departed with their prisoner. Fred Durkin, who had been waiting outside in case of trouble, followed. Eloise excused herself shakily. Claudia remained seated, trembling too hard to stand. Wolfe turned to her. "Miss Venn, your actions were criminal but not murderous. Inspector Kramer will decide your formal consequences." Claudia nodded slowly, exhausted but relieved. Wolfe tugged the bell cord. Fritz appeared. "Mr. Goodwin will escort you to the front room," Wolfe instructed Claudia. "You will remain here until arrangements can be made." I stepped forward to guide her, but Wolfe held up a hand. "Archie." "Yes, sir?" "You will first escort Mr. Brenner upstairs personally," Wolfe said, gesturing to Fritz. "Ensure he remains unmolested." Fritz blinked in surprise. I nodded. "Of course." Wolfe's eyes held mine a beat longer than needed, gratitude disguised as command. "See to it." I helped Fritz toward the elevator. He whispered, "Mr. Goodwin, I am indebted." "Not to me," I said. "To Wolfe. I'm just the guy who dodges punches." He smiled weakly. When I returned to the office, Wolfe was already settling back into his chair like a man reclaiming a throne after unwanted exercise. The storm of the night had passed, leaving only its signature scent, justice mixed with Wolfe's irritation at wasted time. I pulled out my notebook. "Want the summary now or after dinner?" "Pfui," Wolfe muttered. "Dinner should have been served 10 minutes ago. Summaries wait for digestion." Kramer would call that obstruction. Wolfe closed his eyes briefly, then opened them with resignation. "Archie?" "Yes?" "Stop talking," I grinned. "With pleasure." As I swung the door open, Fritz's voice floated from the hallway, announcing the first course. The brownstone warmed with the domestic comfort that always follows a case cracked open and a killer delivered. Some men say justice tastes sweet. Personally, I say murder cases are terrible for one's digestion, but excellent for keeping one's boss honest about gratitude. And from behind me, Wolfe muttered one last word, "Pfui," which, in Wolfe's world, meant everything had ended exactly as it should.